Welcome to Module 3, Day 1, the EdTPA lesson plan walkthrough. This is going to be just a step-by-step walkthrough, taking it nice and slow. Each slide was going to contain a couple areas of each of the sections of the EdTPA lesson plan. And what I'm going to do is kind of talk it out of what should be present there and what you should be thinking about, possibly giving some ideas. What I would invite you to do is, before you play this video, I would make sure that you have this document, that EdTPA lesson plan, in front of you, possibly in a PDF format or even in the Word document format like I have it displayed here, so that you can just kind of jot notes and ideas. It's kind of a good idea as well, if you have an outline of the sort of lesson you want to do, or you have some notes on it in a document, as you watch this video, just being able to write some things in here and populate some of this will be the best way of going about it. And then you can use the discussion board regarding the EdTPA lesson as a place where you can say whatever you flesh out in a section, write that in, ask your classmates, let us have some discussion about it. This is good, this is bad, have you thought about trying this? Would you want to add that? And let that be a place where people can kind of grow into a lot of their lessons. I will try and wait until anything in that EdTPA discussion board is there for at least a day, so that I can allow classmates to comment before I throw any comments in, mostly because I want you guys working together and kind of hashing out ideas actively and sharing them. And too often when a professor enters in something into a discussion board, it's kind of like, all right, and that's done. And that's not what I want there. I really want you guys to explore and gain some insight from the diversity of lessons you guys are preparing for different grade levels, different content. Invariably, two people choose similar content, and that can be, really helpful as well. All right. So let's go back and let me look at the EdTPA lesson plan walkthrough. And this slideshow is very simple and very straightforward. And I'm just going to add some words to it. I welcome you to use this walkthrough as okay, today I'm just going to deal with the first page. The lesson components are the lesson goals, the objectives and demands, the lesson considerations, and then the lesson plan details. And that is the moment-by-moment walkthrough of the lesson plan, where you are saying, first, I'm going to open it up by saying good morning, and here's what we're doing. Do you remember what we did last time? Things of that nature. And then you're going to move into your primary lesson and the content you want to deal with in the lesson. Finally, ending up with closure, some form of assessment, hopefully, and then something as an extension in case you have extra time or to lead you to the next lesson. And then the final section there that I look for people to do is assessment. And I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago. Those final sections in the EdTPA lesson plan are valuable. You are scored on them. But in the couple classes I teach where we really go in depth about it, these first sections are the heart of teaching and learning and what we need to do as instructors. So I have these broken up, the first one being lesson goals. And the lesson goals section, let me separate mine out here so I can see it as I talk about it. The lesson goals section has two items in it, the central focus and the standards addressed. Now, the central focus has two questions that are in there, and I really encourage you to let these questions be guiding questions. That's what they're there for. I remember when I was in my teacher prep program, we just had blanks that said central focus of the lesson. We didn't have these guiding questions, and that's really nice from EdTPA to give us a little more to go on. I remember in my undergrad in teacher training, it was just like a list of things to do, and it was sort of best of luck. We got some samples, but as the only math person, it was a bit of a struggle. So the central focus, we want to think IEP goal. okay? We want the focus or the big question of the lesson, and we don't answer big questions in single lessons, if that makes sense. The lesson objectives and demands is another section. That's the next section. This is the lesson goal, so it's sort of the big picture stuff. It could be a benchmark of an IEP goal, something that's leading you along the way. Whatever it is, make it tie directly into some IEP goal. For us, the central focus of all of our work as people who generate specialized instruction, all of the reasoning around what we do always goes back to the IEP. That is the rationale for us being service providers, and that is the annual outline of what we are working to achieve in that year. At the same time, when we're talking about an IEP goal, I just like to remind people that IEP goals should address some area of the expanded core curriculum, if not several. Literacy goals can address independence. When you're, say, shopping, can address your compensatory skills, so you have access to educational materials. It can be address sensory efficiency, because we are teaching students to be more tactually aware and sensitive, and what they can read is growing as a result. So it is okay in that central focus for us to talk about something around the expanded core curriculum. We probably have a little more to say in that central focus of the lesson if we talk about the expanded core. And I know we haven't spent an immense amount of time in it here. We do a lot of that in your next two classes, assessment and problems, methods, materials. But just know that Braille is a compensatory skill. Tactile sensitivity is a sensory efficiency skill, and that is pretty much where we are living. Obviously, those skills support independence, can support orientation and mobility. If you're reading signs in your environment, can impact things around self-determination, around career readiness, all of those things. Keep it focused, keep it tight. Compensatory skills and sensory efficiency. That's really what we are working on. Braille being the compensatory skill and the tactile being the sensory efficiency. And that's sort of where we're going. That our benchmark IEP goal will be Braille literacy broadly. You can specifically give whatever benchmark you're working on, say learning your letters, learning whole word contractions, learning first letter contractions, learning like two-letter. It could be any number of things in that area. So the second thing is standards addressed. And this is where we are outside of our box. Because we are teaching literacy, we are in service to a common core standard. Now, I want to be really clear in saying this first. You guys had some material posted up for you guys that were state common core standards in Braille. We in the state of North Carolina do not have Braille common core standards. So in prepping an EdTPA lesson for the state of North Carolina, you cannot hang your hat on California or Texas state standards. As it relates to the Common Core standards, the NC, SCOS, and Common Core, we are looking at literacy. You're going to look at some grade level literacy goal. And pretty sure I put the links in for NCDPI. If not, someone please remind me in the discussion or send me an email. I'll double check after this. But we need to be serving one of those goals, because if we are teaching a compensatory skill, we have to address what it's compensating, what that student is getting access to. So I just recommend you find a grade level Common Core standard that is related to, say, the material you're using, or for the activity you are addressing and put that in there. You can ask 2 questions of yourself if you're finding this piece to be rather challenging. The first one is, what are we doing to make the student independent? If they could do this activity independently, what common core would they be addressing in the classroom? As well as, if we are done, what common core can they now handle by themselves as a result of this additional training? So that really is the lesson goals part. We're looking at IEP goals as our territory for the central focus, and then for the standards addressed, we're looking at the Common Core North Carolina standards. The next section is lesson objectives and demands. And I apologize, I should say, if you are using this video as a working video, which is what I encourage you to do, I would pause it now and attempt to write something in those 2 areas. Try and get something worked out, look up those standards, and pause the video and kind of try and get that filled in. The next section. The next section are the lesson plan components. And the lesson plan components have several pieces in there. Oh, wait, no, I skipped one. I apologize. Sorry, I'm having think. Lesson objectives and demands. Woo! I apologize. So that next section has 3 items in it. Lesson objectives and demands have content objectives, language objectives, and key vocabulary in the lesson. The good news for you, since you are generating a Braille lesson, is it's all literacy related. So the language here will be easier to deal with than it would be, say, if you were teaching a monocular telescope lesson for scanning your environment. Many of the skills and work we do in technology training and other things don't fit the mold of the language of these lesson plans as well. So that's why doing in this class a first lesson plan in something that is really catered to literacy, the way they format it, it's a good first go. So the first area is the content objectives. And the question they ask in the lesson plan is, what will the students know and be able to do by the end of the lesson? Use observable language with measurable verbs. This can be redundant a little bit from the central focus of the lesson, or it can feel that way. If in the central focus of the lesson we gave the IEP goal, what we are persistently over time working on, the big goal, we could have named a benchmark in there to kind of focus it down a little more as well. This is where we definitely want to make sure we put a benchmark, because benchmarks when we write IEP goals are generally observable language, measurable verbs of our progress. So you may feel the content objectives are a little redundant with the central focus of the lesson. That's okay. If it feels completely redundant, 100% everything you said above you're saying here, you will want to look back at that central focus of the lesson and maybe choose to bring some of those benchmark details down here into the content objectives. We really want to make, and I can't emphasize this enough, to state measurable objectives or outcomes. And I really encourage people in my classes, try not to say 75% proficiency on 3 out of 4 trials. And I'm going to pick that out as an example. 75% proficiency out of 3 out of 4 trials is 75% accurate 75% of the time. That's not very good if our goal is, independent literacy. That means about a third of the time or a quarter of the time they're getting things wrong. And a quarter of those times they didn't even meet that objective. So I encourage you to write goals that are at least 80% proficiency and to really have targets when it comes to literacy. Actually, in so many things we do, the benchmark is getting to 100%. That is really where we want to be. We can move on at 80 or 90%. But for the lesson content objective, we can move on at, say, 80 or 90%. But then on the full scale and scope of multiple lessons over time, we are going to want to be targeting, that IEP goal is probably going to be targeting 100% accuracy, because we need our students to be independent. And only understanding 75% of what you're reading, that's not going to cut it when there isn't always a teacher in the room that can help them with that. So that's content objectives. I encourage you, set high standards, reach for those high standards. High standards mean independent students. Language objectives, the second section in this area. The question that is the kind of starter question that is written on the EdTPA is, what language will students be expected to utilize when illustrating their understanding? So this is the language, not that you are using, the language the student is studying in the lesson, but the language we are using to communicate with our student around the topic of Braille. And Braille has its own language. I mean, I think I've already used word sign, letter sign, group sign, first letter contractions, whole word contractions. We have words around all of that stuff. If we are using any of that language, we want to put it in here, that the student knows that when the letter B is by itself, it is a first letter word sign, or just a word sign if you want. You decide how complex you want it to be. So we want to list the language we want the student to use in talking about this Braille lesson, so that whenever we communicate with them, they have a more whole understanding. Given our discussion we just had on italics and bold, we would want to use the language around symbol indicators or type form indicators. The other question in here that we can talk about are, what literacy terms will we use to communicate? Because Braille is a physical form of a written language, it isn't a language in itself, it's just a written form of language. There are words that, say, the teacher might be using in class, words that are directly attached to literacy terminology. This is stuff that you've read in Beginning in Braille and in Instructional Strategies in Braille Literacy. Some of those literacy terminology, the 5 critical elements of literacy, things like that, that we may use to communicate with the student. In education in the last decade or more, the direct use of the academic terminology of literacy is just used far more often. And so this is the place for us to acknowledge that and identify any terminology we might be using or referencing. There are 2 parts to this, and I want to say it one more time just to be clear. There's the language of Braille that we want the student to use to talk about what they're encountering, types of contractions or indicators that they're using. And then there's the language of literacy that, say, the classroom teacher and the literacy teacher are using, that we are going to use in communication to talk about things and relate the Braille to the print literacy. So those are the 2 components in the language objectives. I don't necessarily need you guys to go way down the rabbit hole on this. I don't need you to expand this out in every possible way and have it be about 3 or 4 pages. But in terms of the language objectives, 1 or 2 Braille literacy terms and 1 or 2 Common Core-ish literacy terms would be sufficient in this area to identify that language. That way the person reading this lesson plan knows what language the student knows and what language you're intending to use to communicate. Then the key vocabulary is really nuts and bolts. It's a list of words. It feels kind of redundant when vocabulary, if you're working on vocabulary as part of the lesson, it may feel a little redundant, but those new words you are introducing, probably words that include certain contractions or sight words that we want to make sure we reinforce, that's going to be your key vocabulary for the lesson. This one takes a little more time and effort, I find, because this is the metacognition of the lesson, where we are talking about what we want to talk about. And metacognitive practices are something that we all do at some level, but then when we're asked to write it, they tend to be, in my personal opinion, a little challenging to get right frequently. So take some time with this, write it out, and what you'll need to do is you will need to come back to this section after each other section of the lesson. So when we take care of the considerations, we'll want to come back here and check that we tagged all the bases. When we write out the actual lesson flow and activity, we'll want to come back here, because we may, when we're writing out the lesson, use a term that we hadn't thought we were going to use when we originally started everything. And as a result, we need to come back and include it. So this is an iterative process, writing a good lesson and getting it solid. I'm going to pause for a moment and just acknowledge that normally when you are writing lessons, you are just progressing in a more linear fashion than an assignment like this presents. So I afford you a great deal of levity to identify certain conditions or to kind of hem in what you're doing and make your lesson smaller and focused. The smaller and more focused your lesson is, the easier this section is. If this section feels really cumbersome and like you're having to list a million things, move on and come back, acknowledging that you probably are going to be able to shave it off a little once you look at what's kind of realistic to be done in a lesson. So go ahead and pause the video, give that a shot. I wouldn't spend more than 15-20 minutes on this section, say at this time as a first go through. Just acknowledging that, pardon me, my voice, acknowledging that you're probably going to come back and refine this section a little more than others. Great. So if things went well, you've kind of covered the objectives and demands. Hopefully the objectives were really straightforward and you hit some benchmarks of what you're going to measure. We'll come back to that later as well. And you've fleshed out some of the language of what you will talk about when doing this. Now, the next section is lesson considerations. And lesson considerations has 3 sections: materials, prior academic or prerequisite skills, and misconceptions. So the materials should be pretty straightforward. And I'm just going to read exactly what it says there. What are you going to use to teach the lesson? Do you have a book? Cool. Put the name of the book down. Are you generating a worksheet or a practice sheet, like a tracking worksheet? Great. Give it a name, reference it, and then that will be attached at the end of this lesson. Whenever you turn this lesson in, I expect to see this document all filled out with probably 3 or 4 at least extra documents at the end of it that are your assessment materials and the handouts to the student. Things that you've generated, maybe writing a few sentences, maybe creating a word list, who knows what. It could be flashcards. If, say, you're working on building up sight words, and so you have a flashcard deck that throughout the year you are always adding new words to as you introduce them. And so your student is, working on constant proficiency, recognizing those words over time. I think that's a really great strategy. Whatever materials you are going to use with the student, give it a name and just list it here. And then whatever that document is should be found at the end of the file or as an additional file you post. Don't feel like you need to have all the materials listed out right here, right now, because while you're writing the lesson, you may decide, okay, I want to include this. And you're going to need to come back and add the material. So understand this is a working document. No need to beat a dead horse there. The prior academic or prerequisite skills. This is everything the student should know to be successful in this lesson. In a normal environment, this is what you did yesterday or what you did in the previous lesson. As it pertains to this particular assignment, this is your place to show me you are aware of what skills are necessary to do this lesson. It is also your space to decide, I'm assuming the student knows all of these things, so I can focus on this new skill. You have permission to hem in this imaginary student's prior knowledge such that you can really focus in on that one thing you want to teach. As you work out the lesson and you go through the words that you may use, the sentences you may want them to read, or whatever you're doing in the activity, you may go, oh, they definitely need to know this contraction, or they need to know how to spell this word. Come back up here, drop it in, go back to what you were working on. Now, misconceptions. This is the fun part. I mean, if you really wanted to, you could write a book on all the misconceptions that exist, and your purple book and your beginning with Braille and your instructional strategies all have Braille mistakes and potential misconceptions. They are in there. I want you to keep the misconceptions really focused. I want you to target things that directly relate to what you're teaching right now, like say you're teaching OW, it is a reversal. So you could deal with a misconception that OW and O could be confused because they're a reversal. Really keep those related directly to the content you're addressing. Your misconception should not be a list of every misconception that could exist on every prior or prerequisite skill. And really focus on the likely. If you have a student in mind, this is a great place to make it a little more individualized and say, this student always gets IN-EN backwards. And so what I'm teaching has a reversal, so I'm going to try and make sure this student has these issues cleared up. Or the student always has trouble reading dropped letters as the letter in the upper part of the cell. maybe even when they stand alone, right? That's another piece of terminology there. So identify those things. I'm not going to grill you on misconceptions, because when you're not working directly with a student and you haven't had a lot of practice, your knowledge of misconceptions comes primarily from things that are talked about in the books. I will look at the prior skills to make sure you've identified which skills the student should have. I'm going to pause here and just acknowledge you shouldn't be able to fill this entire section out right now. Okay, you should be able to jot a couple notes in here, list out the materials you would like to use and maybe put a short description on it. List out the prior academic or prerequisites that you think will be necessary to be involved in your lesson and what you're doing. The misconceptions you're going to look up later or think about as you're doing the lesson and walking through it. You're really going to build this piece out as things come to mind and you check your actual lesson plan against this section. As a reader of an EdTPA lesson plan, when I get to this section and I read it, I'm getting a preview of what I'm going to find next. I can establish all of my preconceived notions about what a student knows, about what that might mess up, and what materials are going to be set out on the table, used in the lesson, accessed by the student, accessed by the teacher. If you're going to have a checklist to check off student progress as they work through things, I'm going to know about all of that when I read this section so that I am all keyed up. And whenever I get into the lesson itself, all of the pieces of your lesson are going to make sense because I've had this preview right here in the lesson considerations. And I think this was on the previous, no. It's important to know, never mind, I think this is on the next slide, one of the future slides, that this lesson is being written so that a teacher of students with visual impairments can teach it. Say, it's rare for us to have substitutes, but if another teacher came in and worked for us, or say we were out and another colleague was going to make sure that the Braille lesson happened for that student, they should be able to pick up the lesson plan as a professional and go through it and know exactly what they need to do, when and how. So at this time, I am going to the second page, which is the lesson plan details. The lesson plan details are the really step-by-step nuts and bolts of what you're going to do. The pink text at the top of the page, I think, says it perfectly. A detailed outline of your class session, including instructional strategies, learning tasks, key questions, key transitions, student supports, assessment strategies, and conclusion. Your outline should be detailed enough that another teacher could understand them well enough to use them. Include what you will do as a teacher and what your students will be doing during each lesson phase. Include a few key timelines. Note the italicized statements and scaffolding questions are meant to guide your thinking and planning. You don't need to answer them explicitly or address each one in your plan. Delete them before you type your lesson outline. So the questions that are in there are guiding questions. You don't need to hit all of them, but if you're stuck, you don't know what to do, try answering one and then get your flow going. So the first section of the lesson plan details is the introduction and where we're going to start in the lesson. And frequently, our lesson introduction is sometimes accomplished in the hallway, on the way down the hall, bringing the student from, say, their normal classroom to wherever we're providing specialized instruction, and we're checking in with them. I always tried to have, a quick, how are you doing? How's your day? How's everything going? For like 1 minute of the walk down the hall, because who knows where they put you. And then I try and get a little bit of the introduction, anticipatory set stuff done when we are walking down the hall, so that we're addressing things and getting a little bit of that work out of the way. So when we sit down, we're ready to get right to it, and the student is cued in. Otherwise, you may end up talking about the student's weekend for 10, 15 minutes. The first part of that that I like to look at is the anticipatory set. So getting the students' anticipation of what they're going to learn and what they're going to do. That it can normally be, in the math world, we really like anticipatory sets because they do two things for us. They review what the student learned last time, and they may set up the situation that we are learning about this time. For math that is taught in a very linear fashion traditionally, that works out great. Braille is also taught in a fairly linear fashion. And so as a result, we might want to, let's just review what we did last time, and we're going to read a couple sentences here and make sure you recognize everything. And they read those sentences out loud. They do fine with them. We know that the prior learning from the previous lesson is set. Maybe we know they practiced or did their homework. And we can put another question in there that maybe they haven't learned yet. That will be the topic of today's problems. Maybe something they could figure out if they're clever and if they're really thinking about it. But if they don't get that sort of extra question, then we can jump right in and say, cool, that's what we're going to do today. So after today, you're going to know exactly what that thing is. Awesome. The goal of the anticipatory set is to get the student in the mindset of doing their work and to draw them in. So some of your review of prior work could be a statement. They could say, hey, we learned these contractions. Here's what the cells are for them. They could type them. They could read something. There's a lot of things you can do in this sort of introduction to get the student where you want them to be for the lesson. The important part of the introduction is we want to give them a solid expectation of what we are going to do during the lesson so that that's perfectly clear. They know where they live. Students expect to be guided in instruction. Younger children expect to be guided in instruction. For those of you who may at some point work with adult learners really want to know the payoff in what they're doing. They want to see the value in what they are learning instead of being kind of mysteriously guided along and, some aha moment 8 years later in middle school. So think about the introduction now. Maybe not flesh it out completely, but jot a couple notes. Are you going to make it review prior work with a statement, with some reading sentences, with a writing activity, a discrimination sheet, almost like a tracking sheet, something like that, where they're identifying the different words? What are you going to do to kind of get them drawn in a little bit so that you've got that loaded up in your head? It's really hard to move on in the lesson, and you can flesh it out later. If you're a very linear thinker, maybe flesh it out now, come back to this video in another half hour, or tomorrow, and really get that piece worked out. Remember that in the lesson plan details, it asked you to include a few key time guidelines. It's really important in our work where we are sort of hemmed in on a traditional school schedule. that we are saying, I'm going to spend 5 minutes on the introduction or 3 minutes on the introduction, so that we can put kind of a time stamp to each of these lesson plan details so we know about how long they're going to take, so that when we're finished, we know this is a realistic amount of content. The less you write, the more likely you are giving large, broad outlines that might not fit in your timing. The lesson plan activities. So this is what you're doing during the lesson, and I've never really liked that term, because the entire thing, even the before the lesson, the introduction, it's still your lesson plan. So it's always, it's all the lesson to me. In the activities, we want to give a step-by-step of the lesson. It should really be clear what you're going to do and when. It should almost read like a transcript or a play, in that you're going to say this and ask the student to give a response. You're going to ask the student to do this, and you're going to write what you expect the student is going to do at that time. It should be enough that another TSBI could teach this lesson pretty much the same way you would teach it. And I want to emphasize, as someone who's walked into a lot of other people's caseloads over my professional career, when I've walked into another person's caseload and been the new teacher for those students, the thing that helps everyone feel comfortable is establishing some form of consistency with the prior instruction before you make any personal notes or changes to things. And we're always, as professionals, going to want to do something differently from someone else. That's just, we're creative people, we are smart people, and as a result, we are always going to want to slightly adjust what we do compared to someone else. And I just encourage you that if you want people to follow your lesson plan, when you come into a space, try and keep that consistency as alive as possible for everyone's sake. The student will learn better, the other teachers will respond better to it. It's important to acknowledge on this that the lesson plan activities, the step-by-step on it, is not intended for a classroom teacher. And it is not intended for someone who is serving as a classroom aide. And you know what? I have to apologize to people who are watching this video. I did not turn on closed captioning when I began. I was in my space. It is on now. I will load this to YouTube so that it will auto caption the entire thing. So actually, I'll just turn this off now. My bad for those of you who enjoy having access to the captions. Was just getting excited in my space. So you want some things to just kind of guide you in what you're going to put in here. What is the teacher sharing? What are you saying out loud to the student? What materials are you putting in front of the student for them to interact with? What materials are you putting in front of yourself as, say, data collection or record keeping in order to know that your student is meeting your proficiency guidelines of your lesson? What's going on there? So you want to write all that out so that the teacher reading the lesson plan, if it's me or someone doing an EdTPA review, so that we can have a real clear picture in our head of what the teacher has laid out in front of them, what the student has laid out in front of them, and how everyone's engaging these materials. That, remember, the person reading this lesson is going to have to mentally paint this picture. And so the more information you give them to assist them in mentally painting the picture, the better understanding they're going to have of what you're trying to accomplish. At the end, well, no, the next piece is, what do you expect the student to be responding with? What kind of information are they going to say out loud to respond to your instruction? So whenever you write something like, I asked the student, how was their day? Or do they remember this contraction? Then you might want to put in there, if the student says XYZ, or that we looked at these contractions, then I know they are queued up and they're ready to go. You may also look for something like, this is a good place where we might identify misconceptions that may have been acquired from the previous lesson. So if you have something here that you are looking for an answer on, and you have something in mind that would be a wrong answer to the question you're asking, then you might want to put that up in the misconception section as a misconception the student might have coming into the lesson. So this is a good time when you think about the responses the student provides, that you go ahead and put something in there up above under the misconceptions that the student might have regarding this lesson. The final part of the activity, during the lesson, that I want you to really make sure you dig into is, what is the student doing that is telling you that they got it, that they understood what they needed to do in the lesson? Are they reading something independently and proficiently? Are they identifying certain contractions or certain words in the text as they read them and acknowledging that those are words that have the new thing we learned? Are you keeping this will normally tie in some way to some form of record keeping that you are doing as a teacher to acknowledge that the student is getting there with whatever they're learning. That piece, okay, whatever it is that we are making note of in this section to acknowledge that they got it and that they're making progress, that goes back up to the material section. That goes back up to the material section so that we can acknowledge that checking something off on a checkbox, marking that they did accurately identify a certain contraction, or that they did make a connection between some of the materials. That is all information that we are going to want to keep record of. If we don't keep record of it anywhere, then at the end of the day, when we finished our lesson or our IEP goals or whatever we're doing here, we don't have evidence of learning. And evidence of learning for us is going to always exist in our lesson directly. And it's going to have to be something that we make sure we record so that we can prove we did something, right? We've got certain hours that we are delivering and time. And so that little sheet that has checked off boxes and a date on it and everything else becomes our evidence of learning and our progress monitoring towards our IEP goal. So I strongly encourage you, when you answer the question, what during the lesson will let you know the student gets it, and how and when is the student responding, that you are going to be going back up to the materials section and making sure that you've got that material for recording the information as you go. And this is a good time as well to write that out, whatever that data collection tool is, and to directly in the during make sure that material, that record keeping material, has a name, and you are referencing back up to that material in the name, and it's posted at the end of your lesson. It's designing a good lesson is not necessarily a linear process. if we're doing a really good job of it. If you can keep all of that in your head, which cognitive psychology says you can't, it ends up being a iterative process where we are creating an iteration and making a new one and making a new one and slowly refining it over time. I would recommend you spend, you just give yourself a day with 3 to 5 minimum 45-minute chunks of time to work on this. And you're just going to sit down, you're going to write and answer the questions. You're going to double check when you're done writing that the things you've written are referenced in the materials, in the goals, in those areas. And then you're going to get up from it, go do something else, and this is really important. And then you are going to come back to it more than an hour later. The reason you're going to come back to it more than an hour later is that I want you to have your head get filled up with something else. This is actually a process writers use to ensure clarity. Get your head filled up with something else, come back, read what you wrote, check your references and materials, and make any necessary improvements to what you have there. And maybe only do it 2 or 3 times like that. But I really encourage you to not do this section in one sitting, because it's really easy to miss something or assume you did it or rush past it or write it in a way that may not have been as clear as you like, and then not come back to it and just sort of have it locked in your head the way you intended it, but not necessarily the way you did it. Okay? So I encourage you, go over this piece a good bit. Each time you come back to it, cross-reference the things before and maybe add a little step, like this next step on closure and extension. So I'm going to the now 3rd page of the EdTPA lesson plan, and that is the closure and extension, the stuff that happened at the end of the lesson. So you see why in that activity, I want you to pour over that. That's the meat and bones of the entire activity. And now when we get to closure, we are identifying, when you're done with the lesson, what are you going to say? Will the student have something to complete at the end? Will they have a proficiency check at the end of the lesson? We were probably having them doing things with guided practice and independently throughout the activity of the lesson. Will we have a summative assessment, sort of a summation of this is where the student was at the end of the day on this day? If you have an activity for the student to complete at the end, say if you're using word flashcards, and when you finish, you're going to go back through and just make sure they're proficient with those word flashcards at the end again. And you will record, how many they got right going through. The formal, traditional classroom summative exercises are not what we normally do, because everything's just kind of progressing in a very organic fashion. We are specialized instruction, not Common Core. But that's not to say we can't. Our IEP goal and our benchmarks do give us something we can do at the end. It's not critical. The important thing to make sure is that we take time to have closure, that we finish and end off the lesson, that we acknowledge what was learned, maybe let the student know what we're going to be doing next. This is a great opportunity for us to allow the student to share what they viewed themselves as learning and its importance and relevance. That metacognitive engagement is something that we can really draw out in the closure after they're not actively engaging new things in the lesson. The other thing we can talk about in the closure is what we're going to do if things go really well or really poorly. If things have gone really poorly, we didn't get through everything in our activity. We may have only gotten halfway through our activity. And so that closure will show the where and why, perhaps missing prior skills, perhaps a real challenge on it. Who knows? It could be, for whatever reason, the student didn't sleep well, or they're just having, if they have some vision but not enough to read, they may have some visual fatigue, which is more than just vision. It makes it hard to concentrate all the way around. Whatever it is, we want to make sure that we close this out, even if it didn't go well. We don't want to be in a situation where we're looking at the time, we've got 1 minute till the end of the lesson, or the bell rings and we haven't finished what we were doing, and now it's like, all right, get to class and we'll pick this back up tomorrow. That's not what EdTPA is looking for in terms of closure. Is it a reality sometimes? Absolutely. It is okay for that to happen. We just don't want to plan for it to happen. And the process of writing a lesson plan like this is to acknowledge what we might do if we find ourselves in that situation, what mental practices we might put in, like checking the time. We want to make sure we start our closure at 1:35, so we have 5 to 8 minutes before the bell rings to just go over it and what we were doing. The other thing about the closure is we want to acknowledge it if things go really well. Because if things go really well, then we may have finished our lesson and we might be done. There is always more to do in our life and in our world as TSVI. And in hindsight, it feels really good when you get your lesson done and everything goes well and just, I got it. We nailed it. The student was on. It feels so good. And then like 2 weeks later, when things didn't go well and you reflect on yourself and you go, you know what? If I had just done a little more of this or introduced that on that really good day, I could have made up for this other bad day. So having some form of extension activity in your pocket, a review activity, just something to do when things go well, a special challenge, a fun activity. A lot of times we will see in classrooms that are working with students that have, say, multiple impairments and other things, we will see classroom rewards being brought in, and that they are not used as necessarily as an extension, but as a always present end of the lesson. I'm not personally a fan of classroom rewards and token reward systems. That's the psychology on that is really clear, that in the long term it's not necessarily the best, but in the short term it helps us get things done. But you may include it. That's your choice. I'm not going to, if you include that as part of your lesson, I'm not going to point you down on it because you aren't teaching the way I would teach. I'm just gonna, that's one of my personal things. For many teachers it works and they love it. Awesome. Every teacher is different. The main thing is the closure and extension should tell us how and when we are finishing, and how we know if it went well or went poorly, and what we did in the case that it went well and went poorly, and then provide some space for the student to respond on how they thought it went and how they're doing, whether it's hard, whether it's easy. Do they feel challenged? Is this, let them talk about it. So in here, put a couple questions that you might ask your student to get a better idea of where they're at. So at the bottom of the third page of the EdTPA lesson plan, there is a pink bar down there that says Note. Attach any relevant handouts, activities, templates, PowerPoint slides, etc. that are referenced and utilized in this lesson. This is where I'm going to call your attention all the way back up to the top in materials, right? All of those things should have been listed in materials. And this is a good time to go, okay, I'm now going to attach those files or put them in here. The core content of your lesson and the vast majority of your lesson plan is now complete. This is when we round back in and make sure everything flows clearly. We can do that because as long as we've laid everything out nicely. Page 4 is the appendix and commentary sections. And the first part of it there is the assessment strategies. I've been talking this whole time about materials, about what we are going to use to assess the students' achievement. So again, back to the IEP goals and objectives, how are we measuring them? One of your 2 assessment strategies should be tied to that IEP goal or measurable outcome that we are working on in the lesson. It should be fairly summative and directly tied to the IEP goal. That's how we know we're keeping good project monitoring, or good, I lost the words. It happens to us sometimes. And I got project-based learning stuck in my head and progress monitoring, where we're using good progress monitoring. Sorry, project got in there and upset the word progress. Have some form of assessment. Your second assessment strategy, I would recommend it being some form of checklist, worksheet. It could be a tracking sheet or vocab cards that you are using. And your second assessment strategy could be, how many words out of how many total words are in the deck, right? If you have 100 words for, say, your sight words for that grade 2 level, then the student has accomplished or can accurately read 12 out of 14 of the words in the deck. And gradually over time in the assessment, there will be a total of 100 words in there, and we'll know the student's good at the end of the term or the end of the school year when they're 100 out of 100, right? And you'll want to have some form of tracking sheet for that. That is just a column for number of words for the year, number of words in the deck, number of words accurately assessed or accurately read, date. And that right there, those 4 columns make a great checklist on progress towards, say, word literacy. You can do something similar to that as it relates to contractions as well. Admittedly, as it relates to this lesson, you're not going to have the full range of all the contractions and everything on it, but there are some great contraction checklists that you can find online. And I want to say there's instructional strategies in Braille. I know I used one from either beginning in Braille or instructional strategies in Braille, and I customized it for my list to kind of put it into order. But long story short, make some form of checklist or tracking sheet. That covers your 2 assessments. Whatever you're going to have in terms of the student IEP goal benchmark, and then whatever you're having as a less formal, more running record kind of something that isn't just words, but is, actually has some hard numbers, data, progress to it. The last page or 2 pages of the EdTPA lesson plan are things that I don't require for this particular assignment. I would encourage you to give them a stab, and I will give you some feedback on them when you complete them on the lesson plan. But I think that as it pertains to this lesson and what we're focusing on right now, as it pertains to literacy and writing a good literacy lesson, that's enough. That's more than enough for us to practice the skill and put it into scope. So thank you guys for taking this walk with me and hearing me kind of expound how probably I would attack this lesson if I were doing it, so that I would take it in pieces. I would come back to it and review it over time and over time and over time to make sure that I've hit all the bases, and how I think this iterative process should kind of go back and forth so that you've touched all your bases. I just find personally, and it's not good for everyone, you don't have to do it the way I suggest. You are adults, you know your own learning strategies and approaches. But I find when you do the whole thing through linearly and then you go back and check the whole thing, that you've got it all kind of locked in your head, kind of like an artist drawing a portrait of what they perceive a person to look like, rather than seeing what's there. And when you take it in kind of chunks like that, it becomes very workable throughout the week to just knock down a little bit of it each day at a fixed time. If you're going to do it all in one day, breaking things out so that you are working on it, stepping away for a minute, coming back and working on it again. Even if you crank through it, I really encourage you to set time to come back, look at it again, so that you're kind of taking fresh eyes to it again. This is important in an EdTPA lesson plan because we are writing this for someone else. Most of the time when we write our lesson plans, when we are practicing teachers, we are writing our notes and our outlines for ourselves. And that is all well and good until the day we don't have to be there and someone else, possibly a sub, although we never get subs, is trying to teach what we teach. And that goes for classroom teachers as well. It's all well and good until someone else has to come in and teach class. Most of the time we write these for ourselves. There are a few times when you're being reviewed in your first years of teaching and when you're doing your EdTPA certification lesson plan, we're writing them for someone else. And the purpose of that is for us to just be very cognizant and careful and clear in everything we do. So thank you guys, and I hope this helped, and I hope it works for me putting those stopping points in there, because that was very much me also role modeling sort of lesson design and approach. Hope to see what you produce.